For people who are watching in New York and Louisiana, in California and India, China and South Africa, why does this matter to them?
This matters because it's time to move on from fossil fuels. You know, this is the same battle that they have everywhere else. You know, each day or each week there's some new leak, there's some new catastrophe in the fossil fuel industry, you know, as well as the ongoing and growing catastrophe of climate change. The fact that there is no rain in Syria has directly to do with these fossil fuel companies. You know, all of the catastrophes that are happening elsewhere in the world has to do with the fact that, you know, North America is retooling its infrastructure and going after the dirtiest oil in the world, the tar sands oil and the oil out of North Dakota, the fracked oil, rather than, you know, they were working with Venezuela. It also has to do with crushing Venezuela, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And rather than do business with Venezuela, they were bound and determined to take oil from places that did not want to give it up and create this filthy infrastructure. So this carbon, this oil is very heavy in carbon and will add hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 to the environment if these pipelines are allowed to. So that is, you know, it affects everybody.
Now, some tribes are for the pipeline. Can you describe the division?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say some tribes are for it. I would say some interests in Indian country have been for the pipeline. I mean, historically, the three affiliated tribes is an oil-producing tribe, but they came down here to support the opposition to the pipeline. They came down there, their whole tribal council came down here a couple of days ago. You know, but the fact is that, you know, some tribes have been forced into production of fossil fuels. 85% of the Navajo economy, for instance, is fossil fuel based. About the same percentage of the Fort Berthold economy is fossil fuel based. So, you know, just to give a little historic picture, you come out here with your smallpox and you wipe out 95% of the people, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people in the early 1800s. They live along these villages, you know, just trying to hang in there. Then you come out here and you flood their lands, and the agricultural crops that they produced are now owned by Monsanto and Syngenta as trademarked, you know, varieties that they created, right? And then you're out here in North Dakota, and everybody in the country flies over North Dakota and looks down and says, well, that's North Dakota. Nobody comes out here. And so stuff continues out here for 100 years where these people are treated like third-class citizens, you know, where they have no running water in their houses and they have oil companies coming out here, and you have high rates of abuse and violence against women and children, and it accelerates and increases in the oil fields until you have an epidemic of drugs, which now hits this community. This community doesn't get any benefit from oil, but the meth and heroin that came out of those fields is here. You know, because those dealers came up here and then they saw these Indian people and they said, well, we'll just go there. And so these reservations are full of it, you know. And then you say, you know, to that tribe up there, they say, the BIA, you know, cuts some backyard deals and starts oil extraction. And so then the
Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then you end up with oil, you end up with haves and have-nots in the oil fields. And you end up with the tribe that now has oil revenues that are coming in. And they look out there, frankly, and they say, you know, things haven't been going too well for us, so we're going to sign a few more of these leases because, after all, you know, nothing has ever worked out well for us. And so we're going to get a little bit of money. And that's how you get, you know, you force people into that with a gun to their head, and then they end up destroying their land, you know, which is what is happening up there on that reservation. And they've had huge investigations into corruption at the leadership. But, you know, you force poor people. You force people into that situation, and it's a perfect storm.
You've talked and written about Native Americans having PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah, we have ongoing. I didn't finish it. I still have it. You know, you say Enbridge and I get this little, like, quirk. You know, and because the Indian wars are far from over out here. But, you know, what you get is intergenerational trauma, is what is known as historic trauma. And other people have it, but you have a genetic memory, and you look out there and you see, every day you wake up and you see that your land was flooded. And that big power line that runs through this land, that doesn't benefit you. You still have to, you know, that everything that is out here was done at your expense, but you still have to pay for it. And every day you go out there and you know, you got a roadblock, you know, that the white people put up coming into your reservation. And every day you go out there and you look at your houses and you see that you've got crumbling infrastructure and nobody cares about it. And you got a meth epidemic and you got the highest suicide rates in the country, but nobody pays attention. You know, and so you just try to survive. That's what you're trying to do. Like 90% of my community, generally, I would say, is just trying to survive. You know, I mean, in my community, we have rice. We still have our wild rice, and we can go and we can harvest wild rice, and we can be Anishinaabe people. You know, we can still live off of our land. You know, these people have a much tougher time, you know, living off of their land. Their buffalo were wiped out. you know. But this here is their stand. This is their stand. They got a chance to not have one more bad thing happen to them. And from my perspective is that $3.9 billion pipeline, these guys don't need a pipeline. What they need is solar. What they need is wind. Look at this wind. You know what they need? They have like class 7 wind out here. What they need is solar on all their houses, solar thermal. They need housing that works for people. They need energy justice. This is this chance, America, to say, look, this community does not need a pipeline. What this community needs is real energy independence. They call this energy independence, you know, shoving a pipeline down people's throats so that Canadian oil companies can benefit and, you know, a bunch of people can, the world can worsen. That is not energy independence. Energy independence is when you have solar. Energy independence is when you have wind. Energy independence is when you have some control over your future. That's what these people want.